Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I'm going to talk about something I had a viewer ask about. They're like, hey Jason, could you talk about time under tension? And it's something you don't seem to care about. It's not something that you promote, but I see a lot of people out there saying that time under tension is important for hypertrophy. And here's going to be my answer to that. The people who say that are generally goofball bodybuilders who have never looked at any real research into hypertrophy, because we've gotten to a point now to where there's a lot, and I mean a lot of research studying hypertrophy in the human body. Some of it's bad and poorly put together, but a lot of it's pretty good research, and we have a very good idea about how to stimulate muscle growth at this point. It's not some ambiguous stuff that you can only draw from what people do out there in the real world. The problem we have with some of the stuff that's drawn purely from the real world, keeping in mind, if we're looking at stuff purely from bodybuilders, they are all very genetically gifted and usually using very, very, very large amounts of anabolic substances. And I don't mean just anabolics. I'm talking a whole plethora of things combined together. Okay? It's kind of hard to draw useful data from that, because at a certain point, anything works for them. Anything works at a certain point for those guys. So we have to have studies that look at this. And people talk about stuff like time under tension. Well, what does that even mean? Right? Because it doesn't mean something of value. If they simply meant, well, more time under tension, if I can do 10 reps with 225 pounds on an exercise, and I get to a point where I can do 12 reps or 13 reps with it, that's going to contribute to probably better overall muscle growth, right? You're probably going to have gotten bigger if you can do more reps with the same weight. And if they meant it purely in that context, we would have something. But we know that that's not true, because studies that look at low reps versus really high reps find that if certain types of volume or quality reps are equated, we get the same hypertrophy in the lab. In other words, a 5 or a 6 rep set produces the same muscle growth that a 10 or a 15 rep set does, if they are taken very close to failure, or to actual muscle failure, momentary muscle failure. The growth is the same. Well, a 15 rep set has 3 times the time under tension. Why is the growth the same? Because the time under tension doesn't really matter. But that's not even what they equate it to. If they just said, hey, I could increase the reps I do with this weight, in other words, more total work, then yeah, that actually does represent muscle growth. But it's progressive overload. In other words, you need to either increase the total number of quality reps you do with a given weight, increase the weight on the bar, or the number of reps you can do per set. That usually involves muscle growth. We know that there's hypertrophy involved there. But when we have sets to where sets that are 3 times longer than another set produce the same muscle growth in a lab, we already know the time under tension component probably isn't a big deal. But here's the problem. They usually equate it to something that's even more meaningless. They don't ever mean that. What they really mean is slow reps. Slow, controlled reps. Well, here's our issue with that. This has been studied. And if you take it to the extreme, you actually get less muscle growth. All right, let's think about it. We only have 2 ways where we can slow down, either on the concentric portion of a lift or the eccentric portion of a lift. On the concentric portion, that's when you're lifting the weight, right? You're lifting the weight. You're not lowering it towards the ground. You're lifting it up. All right. We know on the concentric portion of the lift that when you move it faster, it does cause more muscle activation. We have not proven that it causes more muscle growth. All right, and that's an important thing to remember. We know that when EMG studies look at it, we get a higher muscle activation when you actively push a weight faster. Now, we know that when you focus on it and you focus on a muscle and the mind-muscle connection, that also improves EMGs also, but it's slightly less than moving it more explosively does. So if we were to say, oh, well, if the EMG data would prove anything for hypertrophy, then you would have to conclude that mind-muscle connection, because some people use that data to say, aha, look at that, mind-muscle connection works. Well, yeah, it does seem to cause more muscle activation. It does. When we hook up electrodes to everything and measure it. However, moving the weight faster, usually slightly, and I'm talking fractions of a percent here, slightly outperforms the mind-muscle connection. Now, we do not know that either one of these enhance growth. It hasn't been shown to impact muscle growth yet, because if you just reach failure without doing either one, well, we're still getting the same number of effective reps in theory. But the muscle activation is higher. Okay. That's on the concentric rep. What about the eccentric? And I feel like I almost need to make a separate video again discussing what an eccentric focus training actually is. Because these same people will say, well, there's been studies on eccentric reps, and they show that eccentric reps can produce a lot of muscle growth. Very important for hypertrophy. Well, they're a valuable tool, but they're not required either, by the way. You can do eccentric-less training and actually get maximum muscle growth. You just have to do a lot more work. Thus meaning eccentrics, sure, they make things a lot more efficient, don't they? But with the eccentric training they're looking at is not what these people are doing. They hear, oh, eccentric reps or eccentric overload and think, oh, if I just go really slow on the eccentric, it'll last longer. Well, that's been studied too. Okay. What we found is that eccentrics that last less than 1 second do produce less muscle growth. That is true. But here's what we've also found. That a full second, if you do a 1 second long eccentric, which is usually lowering relatively quickly, but you're not just letting the weight drop. Okay? Some control, 1 second, produces consistently in studies the exact same hypertrophy that 4 seconds does. All right? It's identical. Here's the issue. 4 seconds is 4 times the time under tension that 1 second is. Produces the same muscle growth in the lab. Right? This is where this is going to get really tricky. What does that mean for the whole time under tension hypothesis? Well, if you did 15-second reps or 15 rep sets to failure with 4 second eccentrics, your total sets are going to last 6 times as long. 6 times as much time under tension as a 5 rep set just taken close to failure, within 1 rep of failure. If they produce the same hypertrophy. Therefore, that time under tension meant nothing. Even worse, what happens if you take the eccentrics even longer? And I don't have it handy, but I know there's been at least one study that measured hypertrophy, and you know what they found? That when eccentrics last 6 seconds or longer, they produce less muscle growth. They produce less muscle growth than a 3 or a 4 or a 1 second eccentric does. It actually does less. So just like if you go too fast and you just let it drop at free fall speed, we start talking about less than 1 second eccentric. That produces less muscle growth, and then a 6 second or longer does also. Now you've got a pretty big window there. You've got a pretty big window to where it's optimal. But let's come over to this point. The time under tension itself doesn't matter. It's a completely arbitrary thing that people have made up and claimed that it's important, that is not supported by the actual evidence looking at hypertrophy. It's nonsense. And anyone spouting it is spouting silly, goofy nonsense. Just make believe that they came up out of nowhere. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.